Hello, and welcome to part 3 of your lecture in Stone Age and Ancient Civilizations from the history of healing. So now we'll dive into ancient Egypt, and we know a bit more about ancient Egypt than we do about Mesopotamia and the Stone Age prior to that. So this section might be just a tad longer than the last two recordings. So the map here just shows the area that we're talking about in historical Egyptian empire in that northeast corner of the African continent, but also spreading over into the area that we would consider part of the Middle East now. So ancient Egypt was the world's oldest and longest lasting civilization. So let's break that down a little bit. When I say oldest, I'm talking about the oldest continuously existing civilization, in that the Egyptian civilization in a very different form is still in existence today, but has been the longest lasting civilization in that regard. So the Egyptians are credited with developing mathematics, irrigation, and agricultural techniques developed beyond what was being used in Mesopotamia, writing and the building of ships. And Egypt was probably most influenced by Arabia, which is directly across the Red Sea from the area of ancient Egypt. Their mathematics were the intellectual tools that saw the creation of the great pyramids and temples, and the pyramids some pyramids are pictured there on the slide. And they also developed a very complex societies and left a lasting legacy on the world that archaeologists and anthropologists have studied to a really great extent, because of what they left behind has lent itself to study in ways that we might not have from other civilizations. So this is just a rundown of the basic periods of history and culture running through the ancient Egyptian civilization, and we're stopping this at 332 BC, which is just before the fall of the Roman Empire, which we'll talk about later in this semester in a number of other contexts. And I'm not going to read through this slide. We'll leave that for you to digest if you are interested in diving further into understanding those dynastic periods. But we will have some focus on different dynasties throughout the lecture, and I just wanted you to have that as context. So after the Hellenistic period, after the end of this slide, came the Muslim period at 642 BCE, when the Arabs actually conquered Egypt, and that Arab state has persisted to the present day. The history and culture of ancient Egypt, it was a very stable society for many centuries. It had rigid social hierarchies, which may have been one of the reasons why it was so stable. And there was a belief that the royal family were actually gods and goddesses. And so the royal family was divested with divinity, essentially, by the culture. There were classes of nobles and priests and administrators that separated the royal family from the greater populace, and the greater populace was largely involved with agriculture and crafts, as well as building the mammoth structures that we know from that civilization. The social hierarchy that they followed called for a pharaoh or a king sitting at the top. The priests and nobles were the next line down, then the soldiers, then the scribes, then the merchants, the farmers, and the slaves and servants. And it's worth noting that the physicians were at the same level of hierarchy as the scribes, so pretty much in the middle of the hierarchy. So they might not have been held with the same kind of respect as we see in other ancient cultures. The Egyptian religion, again, like the Mesopotamian religion, is a pantheon of gods and goddesses. So a large number of gods and goddesses, and each one having a specialty area that they're the goddess or god of. It's a polytheistic religion, as opposed to the Mesopotamian, which was pantheistic. Pantheistic means everything is God. The Egyptian religion was polytheistic, meaning the gods and goddesses that we name and our royal family are the gods, and not everything in the world. There were also a multitude of spirits and demons, and a belief in the afterlife, and that depended on the preservation of the corpse to as lifelike a state as possible. And this is why they developed mummification, which has allowed us to have a view into their culture that we would not otherwise have. Societies were generally gynocratic, so ruled by women, and that was in the original ancient Egyptian culture. There was a great honoring of the life cycle and the feminine ability to bring forth new life. And the sun was originally a female goddess, and the moon was originally a male god. And that is the exact opposite of the way most nature-based cultures and spiritualities will view that. Normally, or in other cultures, the sun is male and the moon is female. So over time, their society became more androcratic, more patriarchal, and the sun became a male god and the moon became a female god. So you have this sort of shift happening, and again, we'll see that theme throughout the semester in other cultures. And that was in part to reflect the reproduction occurring in the night, associating the moon with the feminine, was to reflect reproduction occurring at night, the darkness of the womb, where life gestates, and the roundness of the female body, and its various structures. So the world was seen, going back to the slide, the world was seen as having been created out of something called the Atum, which is the absolute principle, and the creator of all of life was seen as undifferentiated and asexual. So there was no gender attributed to the creator of everything. And so that's a juxtaposition to this, the starting out in a gynocratic, female-centered culture, migrating to a more patriarchal culture, but the creator remained this sort of asexual, non-gendered thing. So from this, the wisdom appears as in the early stages as the feminine aspect, embodying knowledge, beauty, harmony, and fecundity, which is ripeness or fertility. In ancient African culture, which we'll study in our next lecture, they also revered the female form, and many traditions were centered around the life cycle, and the womb was seen as being an important aspect of female spirituality. So because Egypt is also located in Africa, it's worth noting that. And the image on the slide here is a depiction of the Egyptian creation myth, with two goddesses pouring primeval waters over the earth as the sun rises over the earth. And so that's a picture of the creation story. So their creation is said to have come about when male and female elements were separated through the primordial couple, whose names were Mot and Shu, and they come from the cosmic egg. So again, there's this gender non-specific original entity and the separation of the male and female elements. The sky was seen as being a female deity, which later took on the name or the identity of the goddess Hathor, and its complement was the earth being masculine. This is again the exact opposite of most nature-based religions. This is an early iteration of the Egyptian myth, and in most later nature-based religions, this was switched, and the sky was seen as being masculine, and the earth was seen as being feminine. So later in the Egyptian period, the solar god Ra became known as the masculine god, and so this is the change of the sun being the masculine from the sun being the feminine. So through consciousness in the creation myth, the human life was differentiated from what would have been known as sort of primordial magma, and with consciousness arose free will and divine spirit, having been sort of initiated out of the abyss of this sort of primordial magma. And the symbology here on this slide is the Ankh. You perhaps have seen an Ankh before, but usually when you see them now, they have a hole in the center of the circle. This is an ancient hieroglyphic character, and it is the sacred symbol for eternal life. And it was later recreated in Christianity as the sacred symbol for Christianity, the cross. So Egyptian gods and goddesses, these are just photos here, and I'll just describe these a little bit more. So the left-hand picture is the Egyptian god of Ra, who I mentioned at the end of the last slide. And you'll note that he has a falcon's head, and the sun is seen as sitting on top of his head, and he's also holding an Ankh. So there's some symbolism there from the slide that we were talking about on our last slide. On the right is Nut, and Nut is the goddess of the sky and is supported by Shu, who is the god of the air. So Nut is, I'll use my pointer, is the goddess that is arching up over as representing the sky, and Shu, the god of air, is supporting, holding her from below. And this is, again, the early creation myth said that the sky was female and the earth was male. So the earth is holding up the sky. There are other deities here on the slide. This is, I don't know how to pronounce this. I say Heh, H-A-H-E-H. Notice that he has a ram's head, and then a reclining earth god whose name was Geb, reclining down beneath here. So these are all gods and goddesses depicted on the slide. We know quite a bit from the medical literature of ancient Egypt, and this is because of the way that they preserved things. And so we have something called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and this is named after the man who found it. It is not named after an Egyptian named Edwin Smith. And Edwin Smith was an Egyptologist, and he focused primarily on very visible aspects of ancient Egyptian society, such as the pyramids and those sorts of things. But from the beginning of scholarly study, there have been a few scholars who have looked at the importance of the process of disease and health on population. And with the turn of the century, new archaeological discoveries, when I say turn of the century, the turn of the 18th and the 19th century, sorry, is what I'm talking about. There were new archaeological discoveries around that time that increased the knowledge of Egyptian language and writing, and the advent of more sophisticated investigative techniques. And so really new life was breathed into studying disease and health in the ancient Nile Valley, and that period saw academic study of Egyptian disease separated into three different categories. And the first is the study of these surviving medical papyri. And there are three of them listed here. And early on, it was recognized that the textual material from the dynastic period that related to treatment of disease was very important for understanding the state of health, as well as the concept of disease in ancient Egypt. And so the second area of study is that looking at artistic representation of diseases in the Nile Valley, and the Egyptians had a predilection to portray life in a relatively realistic manner, and so that offers an excellent opportunity for us to study the way life was for them, because their drawings and their art were making an attempt to convey the realities of life. And then the third area of study, and maybe the most obvious to us, might be studying the actual human remains that they left behind, and that would be skeletal and soft tissue because of the way that they preserve their mummies. And so we have all of this to consider as we look at what we know about Egyptian medicine. So the three papyri that are listed on this slide are just a few of the more commonly referenced ones that survive, and there are a number of others. So the Edwin Smith Papyrus describes surgical diagnosis and treatment. The Ebers Papyrus describes ophthalmology, the gastrointestinal tract disease, head, skin, and urinary tract, with a lot of prescriptions and recipes. And the Demotic Magical Papyrus of London and Leyden describes spells for treating physical ailments. The Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus is one of the most important documents pertaining to medicine in the ancient Nile Valley. It names over 700 medicines of plant, animal, and mineral origins, and hundreds of prescriptions, including weights and measures of ingredients. And it also includes a number of surgical cases and treatment of major musculoskeletal injuries and spells, incantations, and hymns used in sickness and in plague. So we won't go too much into the other two, just in the interest of time. But it's worth noting that often we can't translate the specialist expressions that are used in the medical text, and sometimes the knowledge is either not very exact or it's expressed in a way that's difficult to translate. So we get theoretical knowledge and some ways of quantifying what they did from these, but and we do know that their theoretical knowledge was often successfully applied because of what we see in the archaeological record in the tombs that we find. Of diseases and injuries that were occurring during this time that humans were experiencing, we know that there was an increased population density through the development of this civilization, which brought on new diseases, including epidemics and diseases of childhood. And this may be the first time that these cropped up, or at least the first time we know about them. We have in the Egyptian record the earliest undisputed evidence of tuberculosis. I mentioned tuberculosis earlier. It might have been in the last lecture. No, earlier in this lecture. So this is the first undisputed evidence that we know of tuberculosis. We also see leprosy, polio, smallpox, dysentery, and typhoid. Lots of parasitic infections. I won't read through all of those. Insect-borne diseases were endemic, so malaria and other things that are transmitted through insect bites, as well as some evidence of bubonic plague, which we know is carried by fleas that congregate on rats. There was silicosis of the lungs, which was most likely from breathing in sand, and also pneumonia. Some autoimmune diseases seen, as we saw in earlier parts of this lecture: ankylosing spondylitis, which is an autoimmune disease that affects the spine, rheumatoid and other arthritis there. Sepsis, which is systemic infection, and tetanus due to infected wounds, and those would have both caused death at that point in time, and often cause death now. And cranial trauma in 20% of adult males and 8% of adult females. So the adult males could have been from warfare. Unlikely to be that for the adult females, but we don't. I don't know that we know that fully. Children were weaned earlier, and there was a decrease in the birth spacing. So if you wean the children sooner, there's an increased chance that a new pregnancy will result sooner. And there were some negative impacts of that on child health. So this list of diseases is gleaned from the archaeological record, as well as the conditions for which medical diagnosis and treatment were covered in some of the papyruses that we were speaking about on the last slide. It certainly isn't a comprehensive list, and many of these conditions would commonly cause death. So life expectancy was rarely greater than 35 years in this civilization. Many of the conditions were due to the fact that the region would have been flooded along the Nile River for many months of the year. So malaria, for example, would have been persistent because of that flooding, but also just the simple increase in human population density and the development of civilization. Healing philosophy during this time, very religious and magical beliefs, again, part of everyday life, as we see in other older cultures. Most diseases were thought to be due to angered gods and evil demons, and most treatments began with a prayer or an incantation to a god. So this is a familiar thing. Got some similarities to Mesopotamia. So the priests, doctors, again, we have the priests and the doctors being the same people, usually followed the goddess Sekhmet, and used religious belief to great effect, and many of the cures relied on what we would call placebo effect now. So use of amulets was widespread, and this really exemplifies the belief in the supernatural cause of disease. there were 3 different kinds of amulets that were used. So homeopoetic amulets portrayed animals with positive emulative attributes, so think positive traits that the animal might bring to the healing. Phylactic amulets were used to afford protection from evil. And theophoric amulets were actually those that portrayed gods, and they protected the wearer because they brought the power of that god to the wearer. So the image here is of Sekhmet, who was a warrior goddess, as well as the goddess of healing. And her name means the one who is powerful. And just like many of the other gods we've seen in some of the prior slides, she had the head of an animal, usually pictured as a fierce lioness or a woman with the head of a lion. There was also meant to be a physician to the gods whose name was Thoth, and the Earth Mother goddess of Isis was looked to for her healing powers as well. So healing temples were built in the name of Isis, and these temples are thought to be the forebears of later Greek healing temples, which we'll talk about a bit later on in the semester. Healing practices at this time, so the Egyptian word for doctor is Sawanawi, with the first doctor's name being recorded in history as Hesse-Ra, the chief of dentists and doctors, and he was doctor to the pharaoh Djoser in the 27th century BCE, so this is way back. We also have a record of the first recorded female doctor shortly thereafter, a few hundred years later, Lady Pesachet, and she was referred to as the Lady Overseer of female doctors, so she wasn't the only one. And if one had to be ill in ancient times, the best place to do so probably would have been in Egypt, and not that an Egyptian's chance of survival would have been significantly better than those of foreign contemporaries, but at least an Egyptian would have had the satisfaction of being treated by actual physicians whose art was renowned all over the ancient world. And the medical knowledge in ancient Egypt had a really excellent reputation, and other rulers from other places would ask the pharaoh to send their best physician to treat their loved ones. Treatment was very conservative. If no remedy was known, then only such steps were taken which would not endanger the patient. As mummification, the practice of mummification reached higher levels of excellence and was instrumental in giving the priests some knowledge of anatomy that was not had prior to that. But mostly mummification was done by slaves, and so the slaves might have actually had a better knowledge of anatomy than the physicians in some instances. So I think that that's really kind of an interesting thing. But the dissection of bodies during mummifications seems to not have added greatly to their knowledge of the inner workings of the human body, because the mummifiers and physicians didn't move in the same circles, but also because the way that the organs were removed, they were removed by basically ripping them out through a small incision in the flank, or in the case of the brain, they would scoop out the brain in small portions through the nostrils. So they weren't cutting and laying the body open and looking inside at the way it looked prior to them disturbing the organs. The pharaohs had their own groups of doctors and specialists, as well as priest doctors, and the government controlled and subsidized the system of medicine. So as in Mesopotamia with the code of the Hammurabi, a physician who deviated from normal practice of the time could be severely punished, and treatment methods were very standardized, with the approach to healing not evolving very much over millennia, probably due to fear of doctors of actually doing damage to their patients. There were medical specialists known during this time, including dentists, ophthalmologists, gastroenterologists, and proctologists. And there were also many classifications of medical assistants, including midwives, nurses, and masseurs. So houses of life were locations of healing practice in ancient Egypt, and they were a combination of a temple and a hospital where priests and doctors worked together to treat disease with religious and empirical means. And when we get to the Greco-Roman period later this semester, we'll see this theme again of temple hospitals with doctor priests working in them. And in these temples, incantations or prayers to the gods, above all the goddess Sekhmet, which was the one with the lion head, the goddess of healing, and curses and threats often accompanied herbal cures. So we see this similarity again with Mesopotamia. Prayers and amulets were used preventatively, so folks would carry amulets on them as a way to prevent medicine. The Egyptian physician priest or doctor priest had a number of important functions. First was to discover the nature of the particular entity that possessed the person, and then attack and drive it out or otherwise destroy it. And that was done by some powerful magic for which rituals and spells and incantations, talismans, and amulets were used. The Sekhmet, as the priests that followed Sekhmet, seem to also have been involved in the prevention of plagues in terms of inspection of sacrificial animals and even in veterinary medicine. So the image here on the slide is a collection of Egyptian amulets in a modern museum, and you can see that they take the form of a number of different images that might have had different functions there. There was a very high degree of specialization among physicians. I mentioned some of the specialists that there were on prior slides. And there's nothing certain really known about the way that the physicians acquired their medical knowledge, but one might surmise that after or in parallel to their formation as scribes, they were apprenticed to practicing healers. And so being a scribe, as I said, they were sort of on the same level of the hierarchy and most likely trained as scribes before progressing on to being healers. But it's also been suggested that these houses of life were teaching centers for physicians. Many of the poorer Egyptians probably had little contact with real physicians, and they called for a local medic who would be a workman who was frequently excused from his normal duties to attend to the sick, having some medical knowledge or knowing how to prepare medicines or making home visits. In addition to the use of spiritual healing, which is noted on the slide, they also used herbal medicine, diet, and surgery, which we'll cover in the coming slides. And bathing and other hygiene and massage and manipulation were also very commonly used medicines. The herbal medicine of ancient Egypt included many animal, plant, and mineral ingredients used in their remedies, and the treatments were administered orally, topically, and through suppositories, pessaries, and enemas. That's inserting medicinal substances into various bodily cavities in order to absorb those into the system. The power of the herbs was recognized alongside of spiritual healing, and so they would say magic is effective together with medicine. Medicine is effective together with magic, and that is from the Ebers Papyrus. So some of the examples of herbs used during this time, diuretics and laxatives, those would increase the output of bodily wastes, would be dill, balsam, apple, onions, and parsley. Asthma, they used sesame, honey, and milk, and frankincense. And as digestive aids, garlic, sandalwood, juniper, and mint. So if you've studied any herbs before taking this class, you might know that some of those herbs are still used for those purposes today. The importance of diet was partially recognized. They did have rich, well-irrigated soil, which resulted in a reasonably balanced diet. Carbohydrates from cereal, grains, vitamins from fruits and vegetables, and proteins mostly from fish, given the amount of water that they had in their lives in terms of the bodies of water to the north and the Red Sea to the east, as well as the Nile itself and the fish therein. Milk and milk products were only occasionally consumed, as well as legumes, seeds, and oils. And malnutrition was common amongst the poor or slave classes, which indicates that food was not good food wasn't as readily available to everybody. A restricted variety of food would have caused or aggravated a number of ailments, with some with fatal outcomes. And so there were times when malnutrition was widespread, and even in times when the supply of food was generally assured, the growth of the population was often stunted. And so grown males reached a height of about 1.6 meters and females about 10 centimeters less during the Middle Kingdom. The remains of about 400 paupers who were buried at Giza during the first millennium BCE show signs of malnutrition. And there was a high incidence of hematological disorders present in the bone material that's been recovered in the archaeological record, and that suggests a substandard diet for that population. However, parasites were also surely playing a role in malnutrition at this point in time. You remember when we were talking about the diseases that were seen and treated, there were lots of different parasites, and having parasites, even if you have a good varied diet coming in, can cause malnutrition and play a part in the development of other diseases. So the image here on this slide is of different stages of farming and harvesting process for grain crops in ancient Egypt. Surgery and dentistry during this time, we have evidence that they were performing amputation as well as creating prosthetic limbs, bone setting of fractures, circumcision, filling cavities in the teeth, as well as extracting teeth and draining abscesses. And surgery was only rarely part of medical treatment. As I mentioned earlier, there was a hesitancy to utilize more invasive forms of treatment. Early surgical knives had stone blades made of flint or obsidian, and some of them have edges sharper than current modern surgical steel blades. So it's interesting to note. We think stone blades, oh, that must have been a hardship, but they might have worked better than our current ones. And it would come later through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age before there was the advent of iron blades or steel blades later on. And so the image on this slide is of early Egyptian surgical instruments after they began the use of metals. And that brings us to the end of part 3 and the end of this lecture. So your revision questions are there, as well as on the LMS, and your other food for thought. What are some of the benefits and detriments of an increasing density of human population? So think through that, because that's a theme we'll be discovering or delving further into as we move on through the semester. Here are your references, and if you want to dive into any more of those, they're there for you. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you in your next lecture.